Today we've got the 4-year-old Nazgul on our tabletop, and boy, these are really good looking sculpts. The colour scheme can be used for anything deathly, but let's start by getting our makeup brush out. We started the miniature off with an undercoat of matte black spray, before a rough coat of angel green was then applied onto the clothing areas. Now, it doesn't need to be smooth and silky like the fine clothing worn in the elven realms, because we're painting a dead dude, so rough and ready is the name of the game. Sticking to the makeup brush for the time being, because of its large surface area, some Crypt Wraith was then applied over the top surface of our angel green. Due to the soft bristles on the brush, it makes tasks like painting clothing a real treat, and it can give you some pretty decent results in a fairly short amount of time. But if you would like to do them even quicker, then you can opt for the airbrush method. And I do have a downloadable PDF guide, which you can find on the Swords and Brushes website. I focused my efforts mainly on the bottom half of the miniature as well as the upper torso near the shoulder areas, as this will be the start of our gradient that we're going to do on the clothing. You will notice that there is hardly any paint that you can see on the bristles. That's because as we're painting, we're only hitting the top layer each time, and this is known as an overbrushing technique, very similar to a dry brush, but the paint is ever so slightly damp whilst we're doing so. And this enables us to build up layers of colour as we paint it on. And just switching over to a smaller makeup brush here, to get to the clothing around his tootsies. With just a few minutes work, you can see what we can do with these makeup brushes from a black miniature to a fully robed character. But now we're going to pick out some of those recesses just to bring out some of those shaded areas. A matte black paint was heavily diluted down with some water, and using a thinner miniature brush instead of our makeup brushes, we can now start to create our shadows for the cloth. Because the paint is so diluted, we're basically darkening down the colours that are already there in the recesses. I'd say at this point, go over the whole miniature once and let it thoroughly dry. And then if you need to darken down any extra recesses or deeper creases, then you can do so on a second pass. Now we're going to work on the evil style Dol Guldur metals. We're going to opt for a rough iron base coat for this rather than our traditional method of using a gunmetal, just because we want it to be dark and evil looking. Rawr. So all of the weapons and the armour were covered with this darky browny brassy metallic colour. As there's not too much going on with these sculpts in terms of details, we're going to paint the weapons so that they'll have a little bit more visual interest. And to start with, we will have some brighter colours like a gold and a silver. But don't worry, we're going to make this sword look a bit old and ethereal later on. So we're certainly getting there with these guys, and now we're going to focus on the armour itself. And this time we're going to use a dark tone to go over the whole thing, including the sword. This wash is going to sink into the recesses of the armour and give shade to those nicely sculpted details on the miniature. So when we eventually highlight these metals later on, we will have a nice contrast between the dark and the light. For an eerie Nazgul looking blade, we're going to add some colour on top of the silver, but make sure that the black wash was thoroughly dried beforehand, otherwise this could get a little bit messy. Speed paints are perfect for this because it can tint a metallic colour to whatever you would like it to be. Here I used a greenish plasmatic bolt, but a blue or even a purple would look really cool here. And now for probably the most long-winded part of the miniature itself, and that is highlighting the armour plates. All 127 of them across the 9 miniatures. Give or take a dozen or two here or there. You can speed things along by using a smaller dry brush for this, but because there's only 9 of them, I thought it's not going to take too long to highlight them anyway. But if you were to do this on, say, 418 Morannon Orcs, then you might change your tune. This copper is being used as a mid-tone highlight for some silver that we'll add in a moment. However, if we missed this step and jumped straight onto the silver, it would have looked too extreme and quite Tron-like. Unless that's the kind of thing that you're into. Using a fine tip brush, the plate mail metal was applied onto the copper highlights that we have just put on. However, this time we're focusing mainly on the corners and the extreme edges of the armor plates, so we can still see some of the copper from the previous stage. This will give it a slight glisten to the armor, but more importantly you'll be able to see the detail of the sculpt from a couple of feet away, which is quite nice when you're gaming on the tabletop. And with the cost of these miniatures from Forge World, you might want to spend a bit more time on them, and get your money's worth. But regardless, they are pretty cool miniatures anyway, and I think they've done a really good job to capture the essence of the Nazgul from the film. But what do you guys think? Yay or nay to the sculpts? And would you have done anything differently with them? A little tip here is to not throw away some of your longest serving brushes when they go a bit manky, but use them for things such as doing bases and also dry brushing, just like what we're going to do on the chainmail for this other Nazgul. Because the bristles are completely worse for wear, it makes a great sturdy little dry brush, and pretty good for picking out some of those smaller details, compared with our much larger and flattish dry brush counterparts. Whilst we still had our silver paint out, we switched over to a fine detail brush now and picked out the edges of the sword. You can even use the edge of the bristles to help pick out the central part of the blade. One of my favourite things to do for swords, daggers and knives is to add small lines onto the blade to represent faint scratches that have been accumulated over time through combat. And using a super bright silver such as this Vallejo Chrome is a perfect colour to use to create this. For the final part of the miniature, I'm going to push some of the highlights on the cloak, just to make them stand out a little bit more. And I wanted to add a bit of greeny blue to this. You know, just for that ethereal, ghostly look. The 𝘕𝑚 paint was mainly used to highlight the folds of the cloth where the angel green still predominantly lies. And to make the cloth details pop out even more, some toxic mist was sparingly used over the highlights of the 𝘕𝑚 before. Much like what we did on the armour, we don't want this secondary highlight to completely cover our mid-tone highlight, but rather to enhance it by painting faint lines over the top. It's very easy to make this final highlight a little bit too bright, so if you add a small amount of water to thin it down, and then apply it, you should get a result very similar to this. I even added some very faint lines to the bottom of the cloak as well, just to tie in all of the highlights. You can use these techniques today on pretty much any evil army, including some fine and sturdy orcs from Angmar, which could be a cool future project.